Hey, I'm catiewahwah, and you're watching The Record Review. Hey, this week I'm going to be reviewing FKA Twigs' debut album, LP1. Thank you so much to everybody who requested and suggested this review. It's a really fascinating album and I'm excited to talk about it with you guys. When you get the vinyl, first of all, the artwork is very cool. It's a portrait of FKA Twigs, but it's been plasticized and perfected and then imperfected. It's a great image because it really reflects that surreal persona that FKA Twigs presents as an artist and reflects the music that's actually contained within the album. And then inside the LP sleeve has all of the lyrics from the songs from the album, so if you feel like singing along or even if you just want to know exactly what she's saying, then it's really cool to have these. And the vinyl itself is a classic carbon black. And then you also get a card with the MP3 download codes in case you want to listen to the album on the move. Before we dive into the album itself, let's orient ourselves with a bit of context. So as I said, this is FKA Twigs, real name Talia Barnett's debut LP, and it was released in August 2014. She's previously released 2 EPs, and those are both as imaginatively titled as this LP. The first, EP1, was self-released, and then her second, EP2, was her first release with the Young Turks label. FKA Twigs originally trained and worked as a dancer. She appeared as a backup dancer in a number of videos, including Jessie J's Price Tag. Her name actually also comes from her dance career. Apparently she can crack her joints and it sounds like cracking twigs, although she had to add the FKA when it turned out that another dancer also had the name Twigs, so apparently that's a very popular dance name. I think that her dance training is really interesting and important in understanding how it informs the music that she then creates. It's a very active physical sound, and it's also very emotional yet controlled. If you watch how she dances in some of her videos to her own music, in Video Girl and Pendulum, you'll see that the way that she dances is so entwined with the kind of music that she's making. There's even a line in the song Pendulum, "I dance feelings like they're spoken," which hinted to me that she's used to expressing herself through dance and music, and that this album and her music in general is a kind of culmination of that meeting. I've seen a lot of really interesting discussions from reviewers and critics about what sort of genre FKA Twigs falls into. Some people are saying that she's indie-tronica because of her use of synths and she kind of sounds like bands within that genre, or even the XX. Whereas other people are saying that she's a new form of R&B, I think mainly because of her vocals. However, I think that it does a disservice to her work to try and confine it to one of those existing genres. FKA Twigs' music is truly experimental music disguised as pop, which is really cool because it means that a lot of people are listening to very experimental music. So when I was trying to figure out the genre for this album, I went back and had a look at who FKA Twigs actually says has inspired her. So she listed influences like Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, Adam Ant, and Suzy Sue, which is a really interesting mix and contrast between those two groups. Because on the one hand you have these jazz singers who are famed for having that sort of melodic flow in their music, compared to New Romantics and punk, where the vocals really don't matter. Like, in punk, you do not have to be able to sing well. So I found that meeting and like juxtaposition of these anarchic punk beats and then more flowing vocals that seems to be going on in her influences themselves is immediately reflected in the kind of music that FKA Twigs is then making. But added to that, FKA Twigs has also said that she's really interested in incorporating industrial sounds into her music. She said how she likes to include things like car alarms and kind of permeate them through the music and experiment with that, which adds a whole other kind of techno level to it. Overall, it seems like she's tested out a lot of different styles and you can kind of hear them all in her music, but ultimately she's created a whole new type of music from them. If I had to compare her to any other artists, I do think that she sounds a lot like Portishead, very much like Bjork, and I even think that in her vocal experimentation, she sounds kind of like Kate Bush. The interesting thing about LP1 is that the very first song on the entire album is called Preface. Now, a preface in a book is usually when the author of the same book writes a little bit at the beginning that kind of explains and summarizes what the book is all about. Occasionally that's a quote, or it might be a story about how the book was written, but it just gives you some context about what you're about to experience. So it seems pretty clear to me that by putting that song right at the beginning, FKA Twigs is telling us exactly what the rest of the album is about, albeit in a slightly opaque way. Preface is entirely composed of a single phrase which is distorted and mechanized throughout the song. That phrase being, "I love another and thus I hate myself." It seems to me that there are a few different meanings that we could take from that preface. First of all, there's the idea that you love somebody who you shouldn't love, and that love for them then makes you lose respect for yourself, perhaps. It could also be about loving somebody who makes you feel bad about yourself and who you don't feel like you can be yourself around. Or even perhaps loving somebody who makes you feel like you have to change yourself in order to fit with them. In all of these cases, there's a kind of idea of transformation, but not in this positive way that we usually hear about in love songs, but in a clearly negative way. That negative transformative power of love is then clearly echoed throughout the rest of the album. And then in Pendulum there's a line, "so lonely trying to be yours," which really suggests that element of self-creation and of trying to change yourself to fit somebody else. And the idea that in loving somebody else you somehow destroy yourself and isolate yourself. Clearly, relationships and dependency within relationships is a central theme to this album, and I think that it's in her vocals that FKA Twigs really explores and demonstrates this. She is doing such cool things with her vocals throughout this album. She kind of uses them as an instrument, and then she harmonizes and blends, and they fade in and out at all different moments. She also has this really interesting whispering tone where she whispers in and out and has a very breathy style of singing, which hints at intimacy and seduction. But at the same time, when she sings in this very whispered way, it's sometimes cut off very quickly, suggesting that she has a lot of control over that apparent vulnerability. I found it to be a really interesting audio contrast between the way that the whisper is kind of as if she cannot control herself and she's kind of giving into something, and at the same time she's able to stop it immediately or start and stop whenever she wants to, which to me evoked a kind of deliberate vulnerability and the way that a woman might pretend to be more vulnerable than she is, because let's face it, women are always told that they shouldn't be too aggressive and they might intimidate men if they're too aggressive. So there definitely is a thing within female sexuality and tropes about female seduction that women are expected to be vulnerable. I know it hurts. But at the same time, especially in songs like 2 Weeks, FKA Twigs shows that despite this apparent vulnerability, she is very much in control. There's a trio of songs on the A-side that really explore this audio seduction. The first song, Lights On, is about intimacy and trust. It's about reaching that stage of intimacy in a relationship when you're not just having sex with somebody, but you want them to be able to see all of you and you're not ashamed of any part of you. The breathy singing within this song really evokes that pillow talk and intimacy of a romantic encounter. The next song, 2 Weeks, is basically a seduction in a song. She's mouth open like she uses throbbing beats and whispered, breathy singing to deliver her message, which is basically 2 weeks with her and you won't recognize your old girlfriend. 2 Weeks has a really interesting interplay between that vulnerability that I was talking about before and also aggression, because the way that she is singing seems quite vulnerable and feminine, and yet at the same time what she's singing about is quite dominant and aggressive, and she is clearly in control of it. And then the final song in that trio, Hours, is basically a song that sounds exactly like sex. It's all about that moment of escapism and intimacy right in the middle of a sexual encounter, and there's this real sense of urgency as she's whispering these words and has these throbbing beats going on underneath, and it's clearly building up to some sort of climax, as well as repeating over and over the line, "I could kiss you for hours," as Hours is followed by the song Pendulum, which seems to be about how that relationship has ended or stopped. Hours is a really interesting, for lack of a better word, climax of that part of the album. But I thought that it was cool how FKA Twigs doesn't completely abandon that seductive sound in the rest of the album. In fact, in the final song of the album, Kicks, which is about how she doesn't actually need any partner in order to get her kicks, she revisits and reimagines that same combination of breathy singing and urgency in order to sing about how she gets her kicks on her own. And I thought that that was very cool how in that final song she divorces the idea of female sexuality from necessarily having to have a partner to be with. Female sexuality does not exist solely in relation to other people, it is its own kind of thing. While FKA Twigs' vocals tend to evoke more of those ideas about seduction and sexuality, the way that those vocals and the instrumentation interact suggests something very uncanny to me about this album. So what do I mean by the uncanny? Well, one of the best definitions that I've heard for the uncanny is that it is making the familiar unfamiliar. So it's when something looks or sounds almost normal, almost human, almost natural, but there's something not quite right about it. If you think about ventriloquist dummies, for example, there's something not quite right about them. They're just slightly too real, but they're also not real. In fact, I'd say that the artwork for this album sets up that idea of the uncanny in its very image. We can clearly see that it's a woman, who we know is FKA Twigs, but at the same time it's been plasticized. It almost looks like she's wearing a mask, or she's a mannequin, and there's also this sort of red blob on her face, and it just doesn't look quite real, but at the same time we know that it is real. So it's that moment of uncertainty that comes from the uncanny, the familiar made unfamiliar. And I think that the audio production of LP1 has the same uncanny effect on us. As I said, FKA Twigs is really interested in using these industrial sounds and weaving them into her vocals. And she also uses a lot of synths and drum machines and sort of undiscernible instruments that meld into just sounds on the album. Her vocals frequently become just another instrument within the mix. Those very breathy, whispered vocals again are so human, and at the same time we have these very mechanical noises which are very inhuman. And when those combine, we have this very uncanny and disorientating effect. And this is especially so when her voice is then distorted and replayed and woven back in again. Even in the lyrics of pretty much every song, there are these words and phrases that are just repeated endlessly. For example, as I mentioned in the song Hours, she repeats over and over again, "I could kiss you for hours." Now at first that can seem like a kind of intimate statement, a lovely little statement to be making, but when you combine it with that mechanical noise, it evokes, to me at least, this quite scary idea of a kind of broken machine, perhaps a robot that's been built to kiss somebody for hours, and yet we find it at this point of malfunctioning. And again, going back to that preface, "I love another and thus I hate myself," it makes me wonder whether part of this album is about transforming yourself into this kind of perfect robot for somebody else. In order to please somebody else, you make yourself into essentially a machine for them. You know, it's that terrifying possibility of becoming somebody's Buffy bot. And as a quick side note, I have to wonder whether this idea about becoming mechanized and having your individuality kind of subsumed into a machine also reflects her own experiences being a backup dancer, because obviously when you're a backup dancer, your body becomes a kind of machine for the artist who is directing you. So to me at least, this combination of the way that the vocals and the instrumentation are interacting, and it all seems very mechanized, and it's this human voice falling into this mechanical sound, it sounds to me like a robot girl, who is perhaps a metaphor for the way that women are kind of expected to have this control over all of their behavior and are expected to adjust themselves to whatever their partner needs or wants. I mean, let's face it, compared to men, women are expected to be a lot more in control of themselves, in control of their appearance and their behavior. That's why we have great works of satire like The Stepford Wives, which says, well, women can be so controlled, but that will make them into robots. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that excellent bit of parody on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where we saw a Buffy bot created to be the perfect girlfriend. However, I think that it's important to note that within LP1, this kind of mechanized robot girl is clearly malfunctioning. When she's repeating those phrases and words over and over again, it's as if she's stuck or broken. She is kind of jittering through, suggesting that the album is a rebellion against that idea of women having to be in control, because clearly that's what happens when a person is forced to become this mechanical structure. There are a few lines throughout the album which specifically brought this idea of a robot girl to my mind, so just to kind of show that I'm not just pulling this out of thin air. In the song Hours, she sings, "Am I suited to fit all of your needs?" suggesting somebody who is being custom made or has been adjusted to fit somebody else's needs. And then in the song Pendulum, where she sings, "I'm your sweet little love maker," word lovemaker in that context sounds more to me like coffee maker or something, like another machine for this person. But again, she's not solely this mechanical machine. It's that fusing of the mechanic and the organic that makes this album so uncanny and disturbing, particularly in songs like Pendulum, where we have that juxtaposition of very human and emotional vocals with these very mechanical sounds. And so it blurs the lines of fantasy and reality, calling to our minds how we construct ourselves and how we change ourselves for each other, especially in the context of relationships. That artificiality is fused over our genuine selves underneath. And that image of othering and mechanizing the self is continued in the song Video Girl, which concentrates on the way that somebody is sort of artificially reproduced in a video, but then how does that affect their identity? And there's that uncanny doubling effect of seeing yourself in a video, but looking quite different from how you actually do look or behaving in a different way. Finally, there are two songs on the album that I think are really interesting because they have an almost religious, redemptive tone to them, which is especially interesting after hearing all of these songs about sex and seduction. So those songs are Closer and Give Up. Closer sounds like a Christian hymn from the vocals, especially as FKA Twigs sings about my savior. However, those beats and vocals are then distorted. There are some really interesting lines which actually sound like somebody being converted. She sings, "I was weary, I was sleepy, but you held me through," and then goes on to sing "all those years in isolation," where here the repetition in that final lyric almost sounds like religious chanting. Then in the song Give Up, there seems to be another form of redemption and transformation, although this one is less religious and more driven by the self. She seems to be talking about changing herself, asking somebody, "Tell me why I act this way." And as she repeats the lines, "Just nod your head and give up, I'm not gonna let you give up, babe," it sounds as though either she's asking somebody to take her back, or she's actually talking to herself and trying to coach herself through this period of her life. It's as if after having changed so much, she's having to rediscover herself and get back to what she once was. Thematically, I found it really satisfying that the album then ended with the song Kicks, so it came full circle from hating herself at the very beginning of the album to now loving herself. So overall, I think that LP1 is an awesome album. It's sonically experimental and also has a lot of cool ideas and themes going on in there. So I'm going to give it 5 stars. But most importantly, should you get it on vinyl? While it is nice to have as an album, I mean, it's a nicely designed album, you get the lyrics, it's cool, I would say that unless you have a really great record player and listening setup, you're not really going to hear a better audio quality on this one because there is so much electronic production in the album. So you're going to get the same, if not a slightly better experience from listening to a digital version of this album. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments what you think of LP1. And does anybody else agree with me about that uncanny robot girl theory? Also, be sure to let me know what you'd like me to review next. And if you haven't already, then be sure to subscribe for more videos. Next week, I'm going to be reviewing Ghost Culture's debut album. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye! So this week I'm going to be finally reviewing Ultraviolence by Lana Del Rey.